Hi, guys. I'm John Edward Willie, and in this continuation of a discussion that I had started regarding Para Noir with a video that I had made while I was walking and sort of thinking aloud about these particular subjects and themes and ideas. What I'm doing here is reading an essay that is called Para Noir, and it's about 3,000 words. And it's divided into an introduction, about 8 sections, and then an afterword. And what it is a sort of beginning to a potentially larger work or a continuation of the explorations that are sort of beginning in this essay. I've sort of compressed a lot into this, but what I'm ultimately trying to do is to crystallize in an essay what it is that I've learned over the last 10 years after having effectively stepped back, so to speak, from the political, in meaning that I had been on the left. In fact, I was sort of on the ultra left, if that means anything. And I had sort of decided with the election of Trump and other things that were going on that something had changed. There was something in the air, and I couldn't articulate it, and I still can't. I don't think anyone really can. And I thought it would be better than participating in activities or continuing ideologies or ideals without examining their roots would sort of be a betrayal to thinking itself. I take for granted the idea that the will to truth is crucial. And that also meant effectively dropping out of participating in political conversations. I became rather silent about it on social media, on all other forms, including like being at work and being around other people. I would not speak about the political because I didn't mean to be silent for its own sake, but to attempt to understand much more deeply not only what I believed, but what the people I opposed believed. And in a deeper sense, to have the audacity to try to understand what is happening. And so I'll let the essay do the talking, but I wanted to try to preface this preface as much as I could before beginning. And like I said, it's called Para Noir, and that's sort of my own little phrase referring to my philosophy of the political. And this is the introduction. It's called Uncanny Hush. We live in a bewildering age. The surface of things is bright and glossy, but the seams are fraying. The stories we once told ourselves about progress, about institutions, about the arc of history, are unspooling in small, sharp incidents that accumulate into a new, disorienting pattern. Events arrive like shards. The election of 2016, the tidal flow of refugees, Brexit, the pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, the sudden normalization of mass violence and virulent hatred. Each one is a cut. Together, they reveal a wound that has been growing for decades. What I call Para Noir is my attempt to name an orientation or attitude regarding how we might move into this situation rather than away from it or around it. Our world feels hyperreal, staged, and yet lethal. A political landscape has emerged that is both cartoonish and catastrophic. Our cultural life sells resistance back to us as a spectacle. This introduction is a map of my retreat and my return. 10 years away from the hurly-burly of mainstream politics, 10 years of reading, listening, and trying to think honestly about what has happened and what it means. I did not step back to escape. I stepped back to see. I wanted to interrogate my own certainties, to test the revolutionary language I once wore like an armor, to read the black flag I had carried, and learn the histories and ideologies of those I had once dismissed. I wanted to understand the other, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a set of claims and fears that might illuminate the limits of my own thinking. What follows is not a manifesto. It is a record of bewilderment, a set of hypotheses, and an invitation to think with me about what it means to live in a world that has become, in equal measure, unreal and urgent. Part 1. The Unnameable Age. The Unnameable Age. We can't name the age. There is a quality to our times that resists easy naming. Call it hyperreality, the spectacle, neoliberalism, post-truth. Each label captures a facet, but none contains the whole. The sensation of living inside a constructed set. The props are convincing, the lighting flattering, but the actors sometimes forget their lines, and the stagehands are invisible. The uncanny is not merely an aesthetic or a mood, as much as it is an epistemic. We no longer share a common set of fast facts, or if we do, those facts are filtered through competing architectures of meaning, algorithms, partisan media, corporate narratives, and the private mythologies of identity. The result is a public life that feels both amplified and attenuated. Everything is louder, yet nothing lands. The first problem is the failure of language. We reach for words, crisis, populism, polarization, but the words feel like old tools trying to open a new lock. Hegel's aphorism that one understands an age only by looking back from a distance rings true here. Up close, the world is a blur of contingency, and only retrospective thinking can stitch events into a coherent plot. But we cannot live in perpetual hindsight. We must find ways to think and act in the present without mistaking clarity for wisdom. Part 2. The Collapse of Stewardship. One of the most unsettling realizations of my decade of study is that the institutions designed to steward society, political parties, bureaucracies, universities, media, and even organized labor, are failing to apprehend the complexity of the world they are meant to manage. This is not merely incompetence, but instead a structural incapacity. The scale and speed of global interdependence, ecological breakdown, and technological transformation have outpaced the cognitive and organizational tools for our institutions. Those who are supposed to diagnose and respond to emergencies are often trapped in inherited scripts, electoral cycles, quarterly reports, ideological catechisms. The consequence is a double failure. First, institutions fail to act with the imagination and coordination required by systemic crisis. Second, they retreat into simplified narratives that make governance legible but brittle. When complexity is reduced to slogans, policy becomes reactive and symbolic rather than strategic and adaptive. The people who run things are not necessarily malevolent or evil, but they are often overwhelmed, and overwhelmed people cling to simplifications that promise control. Part 3. The absence of a new wisdom. If stewardship has collapsed, so too has the capacity to imagine a genuinely different future. Across the political spectrum, visions for a tomorrow are largely reworkings of a yesterday. The right resurrects mythic origins and promises restoration. The left recycles narratives of class and revolution that assume a coherence the present no longer supplies. Both sides offer rhetoric but weak maps. The reason is not only political laziness, but epistemic exhaustion. When the world is too complex to be grasped, grand narratives become seductive because they reduce uncertainty, but they also mislead because they pretend to totalize what is fragmentary. This absence of imaginative alternatives is not merely an intellectual failure. The absence is a moral and strategic catastrophe. Without credible visions, politics becomes a contest of grievance management rather than a project of collective construction. People are offered either nostalgia or technocratic tinkering, but neither suffices when the problems are systemic and planetary. Part 4. The Origin of the Bubble. How did we arrive at this strange, floating bubble of uncertainty? The story is long and tangled, but certain strands are clear. The post-war settlement created unprecedented prosperity and institutional stability, but it also produced a complacency about the limits of growth and the fragility of social bonds. From the late 20th century onwards, a set of forces, financialization, deregulation, the rise of global supply chains and commodifications of culture, and the digital revolution, reconfigured power and perception. Markets became metaphors for everything. Efficiency became a moral virtue, and the public sphere was increasingly colonized by private logistics. Private logics. Simultaneously, cultural producers, Hollywood, advertising, and later social media, perfected the art of simulation. They taught us to prefer images to things, narratives to nuance. The result was a collective retreat into a simplified, consumable world. Identities packaged as brands, dissent as style, politics as performance. This bubble is not merely ideological, but infrastructural. Algorithms curate our attention. Platforms monetize outrage. Our financial incentives reward this spectacular disaster. We live inside a system that profits from our disorientation. Part 5. Resistance as commodity. Perhaps the most bitter irony is that resistance itself has been absorbed into the spectacle. Punk music and culture, radical art, and grassroots movements that once ruptured the surface have been repurposed as aesthetic commodities. The gesture of rebellion, slogans, fashion, viral stunts, are easily captured, repackaged, and sold back to us. This is not to say that all activism is futile. There are moments of genuine solidarity and structural change, but the dominant pattern is one of co-option. Dissent becomes a market niche, and the energy of critique is neutralized by its commodification. This absorption explains why so much protest feels impotent. When forms of opposition are legible to the market, they can be simulated without threatening an underlying order. A movement that can monetize is a movement that has been domesticated. The spectacle does not merely distract. The spectacle disarms. Part 6. The Paradox of Post-War Success. It is important to acknowledge the paradox at the heart of our predicament. The post-war order delivered an extraordinary expansion of human flourishing, longer lives, broader education, and reduction in certain forms of violence. Yet that very success masked deeper failures. Prosperity made it easier to ignore ecological limits and social dislocations. The liberal order's triumphs created the conditions for its own unraveling. The concentration of wealth, the erosion of local communities, and the hollowing out of civic institutions. In short, the system solved many problems while generating new ones it could not see. The paradox is central. The world we inhabit is not simply dystopian, but is the product of a long, ambivalent history in which progress and illusion have been braided together. To understand our present, we must hold both strands in view. Part 7. The New Wilderness of the Screen. If the 20th century remade the world through industry and empire, the 21st has remade it through computation and attention. The internet promised connection and democratization. Instead, it has produced fragmentation and surveillance. Platforms atomize publics into micro-communities, each with its own hermetic logic. The result is a new wilderness, not of trees and rivers, but of feeds and notifications. In this wilderness, fear is amplified. Fear of strangers, fear of scarcity, fear of difference. The old Puritan suspicion of the outside finds new life in filter bubbles and conspiracy networks. Technology is not neutral. It shapes what we can imagine and how we can act. Algorithms reward rage and certainty. All the while they penalize nuance. The digital architecture of our lives has become a vector for the very unreality we lament. The hyperreal, online, phantasmagorical social lives we live make the world feel immediate and intimate while simultaneously flattening its depth. Part 8. The Return of Brutal Power. Finally, there is the return of a more ancient force, brute power. This is not merely the spectacle of authoritarian leaders or the theatrics of populists. Brute force is the reassertion of violence as a political instrument. From religious extremism to resurgent nationalism, from state aggression to the normalization of mass shootings, we see a pattern of force re-entering the center of political life. This resurgence is both cause and effect of the hyperreal. When institutions fail to mediate complexity, people turn to simple, muscular answers, strongmen, sacred narratives, and the promise of order through domination. The left's responses have been inadequate, to say the least. Marxist frameworks and radical rhetoric can diagnose exploitation, but struggle to offer imaginative, pluralistic alternatives that address the ecological and technological dimension of our crisis. Meanwhile, managerial elites, financial institutions, tech monopolies, and global bureaucracies offer a different kind of power. Stabilization through control. Mitigation without transformation. They do not promise utopia. Instead, they promise management. The question then becomes, is there room for exception in a managerial society? Can genuine rupture occur when the system is designed to absorb shocks and neutralize dissent? This is the afterword toward a language of Para Noir. These 8 sections are not discrete chapters, but interlocking movements. They describe a world that is at once fragile and fortified, theatrical and lethal, saturated with images and starved for meaning. Para Noir begins with the question of whether we can even name the mechanism or the methodology. A politics of simulation, a culture of co-opted resistance, a technological architecture that atomizes attention, and a return of a new raw force. It is a diagnosis and a provocation. We, if there remains a we, cannot act effectively until we see clearly. Clarity here does not mean certainty. It means cultivating practices of attention and institutions of thought that can hold complexity without collapsing it into cynicism or dogma. It means learning to read the seams of the set and to imagine what lies beyond the stage. It means refusing both the nostalgia of restoration and the complacency of managerialism. Over the next few pages, meaning the pieces I hope to write after this, I will attempt three things. First, to trace the historical and cultural processes that have produced this. Second, to interrogate the failures of institutions and movements that have been swallowed by the spectacle. Third, to sketch the outlines of a different political imagination, one that is modest in its claims but ambitious in its methods. A politics that learns to think in systems, to tolerate ambiguity, and to rebuild civic capacities necessary for collective life. This is not a program for immediate revolution. It is a call to reawaken the faculties of discernment and sincerity and solidarity. It is an insistence that the world, however unreal it may feel, is still the world. Material, contingent, and susceptible to human action. If we are to find a way out of Para Noir, we must begin by naming it, by seeing it, and by refusing to be content with the images it offers us. Only then can we begin the slow, difficult work of making a world that is both livable and true. So that's the end of my little piece. I guess it took me about 20 minutes to read it. And as I said, I'm going to follow it up with other works that are really attempting to make sense of a whole lot of notes that I have kept, because the way that I was trying to set this essay up was to suggest a certain kind of orientation towards the revolution, not the revolutionary moment, but the reconfiguring moment of 2016. And my methodology at that time was to step back and not participate in surface level discussions, but to think deeply about the ideas that were shaping both sides, the left and the right, and many other ideas, and to explore those ideas in the form of great books, great text. I know that sounds crazy and contrary to political urgency and action, but I think that one has to take seriously the classical tradition. And I think that it has an urgency in it that is applicable to our times. You know, especially like Greek tragedies, for God's sakes. There's so much going on that occurs in Aeschylus and Sophocles occurring in our times. And so it doesn't have a practical immediate value, but there is a sense in which nothing has changed. And so paying attention to those more ancient patterns allows us to see the patterns in our own time. That said, Para Noir in itself as a position rejects any sort of return to the past, whether it's left-wing or right-wing or even classicism. Because what I'm pointing at in Para Noir is the singularity of our moment. Because it's my position that institutions and habits of thinking and theories and narratives, they work fine and dandy. I mean, I myself subscribe without even knowing to untold numbers of theories and beliefs, and there's a sense in which our lives are saved by what's sometimes called heuristics, in that there are like rules of thumb that we constantly follow. And a part of a managerial society is creating a society that allows you to sort of foster the better parts of our ability to manage it, especially when you can't predict the future or know the future or even know what's going to happen tomorrow. You create a kind of managerial system, a managerial society, and people live with managers. They manage themselves. And the point is that there's a point of exception. There's a point of singularity. There's a rupture that occurs that actually demands thinking. And so there's a sense in which we don't have to think about anything, and so much is given to us. But there are moments that are moments. Some people say that like every moment counts. Every moment is important, but there's a certain redundancy to that, because it's missing out on the fact that perhaps there are only certain moments, or a few moments even a person's life, that are actually the most significant. And there's another sense that every generation faces a certain problem, a certain crisis, and I don't know exactly what my generation is, but I suspect that it has something to do with what occurred about 10 years ago. And as I say, I began as a kind of, with anarchista like tendencies in myself, which was, in other words, like a rejection of a lot of different left-wing theories, but it was in many ways a way of holding on to the underlying elements that spoke to me. Like, for instance, a rejection of illegitimate power, illegitimate authority, and to think in terms of solidarity and think in terms of collective action that's driven by something other than, personal gain, but is in fact driven by this desire to attack that which is unjust. I believed in attacking, and I believed in a certain level. I had a fanatical view, and I took it very far. I hope to write about and speak about this later as well, given my experience with a whole plethora or garden of ways of thinking about the political spectrum. I've been lucky enough to not only have found some of the smartest people you will ever find in order to engage, but some of the most courageous people I've met, politically speaking, and some of the most craziest people too. That sort of comes along with it, and everybody is crazy on one level or another for even attempting to think politically, especially if you know what I mean by thinking, because thinking itself requires entering a kind of complexity without referring to what AI or what algorithms can offer us, because there's a certain thing that has been emerging within all of our society for a long time now. And it's a combination of things, but one of those things is Google itself and this way in which social media functions. Because on a certain level, it's ultimately selling us back whatever we want to hear, and at a certain level, it's tapped into a genie-like capacity to ultimately delude us into thinking that it has solutions to actual problems. I hope to make a video at some point about like my list of problems or questions that Google can't answer, or that AI or that GTP can't answer, because there's a certain level at which certain questions demand the human brain. And I think that is what is demanded in our time. And what I mean by algorithmic is on the left and the right, because I think of, not to be reductive, but Marxism, including critical theory, as being the same thing as MAGA. And I know that's perhaps offensive, but I mean the extreme versions of it. I don't mean that I don't begin with a kind of deep respect or reverence for Marx. I certainly do. Like, I'm one of those that begins with having been infatuated by it. And on another level, I come out of a classical kind of tradition, and I have a conservative side of myself, in spite of my my more radical proclivities. There's a side of myself that's deeply careful and very sensitive to change. And that comes out of possibly a sort of a deep love for the preciousness of consciousness and holding on to the world and life that we have on a certain level. But again, those call for other videos, because what I'm meaning to suggest is that both of those ways of thinking, and what I mean by that, what I just said about supporting MAGA, is that on a certain level, they're wanting to defend a particular kind of way of thinking that believes that there's a past that contains particular patterns that we can emulate. And that's what I'm rejecting. I think that the complexity of our world, especially in a post-industrial age like we're living in, demands the imagination. I mean, it really demands new ways of thinking. But what it's up against is the possibility that that's impossible in itself, And so I begin with a love of a lot of things that I've had to let go of in the last couple of years, because that's what this essay has sort of, in the end of those 10 years of stepping back and exploring deeply what I believed and what I thought, and getting deeply into the questions that shape those conversations, and exploring the big ideas that shape the left and the right. I sort of came back to discovering that on another level, that no one has a vision for a future, because the fact that there are things happening that literally nobody can predict. And not only that, but nobody's admitting the fact that the things that are increasingly or seemingly increasingly happening in our world have so completely undone so many things that we take for granted that it's almost so akin to Nietzsche suggesting God is dead, or saying that God is dead, meaning that the narratives are no longer believed or are bought into. And so there's a kind of deep cynicism of deep that correlates with the disenfranchisement of our times, and the fact that people feel a deep dislocation between politicians and what, not only what they say, but what they can even do, because they're completely out of touch with being able to interact with what's going on. And even financial people ultimately allow computers and allow these managerial systems and deep state bureaucracies to run things because they're able to prevent the very worst from happening. And some of my writing, or a lot of my writing, has to do with managerial forms. Like, I think that like police officers on a certain level um, are managerial, because a police officer, although they could be either a warrior or they could be a guardian, in different ways, or they can be a horrible person, of course, as we all know, given the recent like expose in the media. There's a certain level at which what they cannot be is a leader, on the fundamental level at which it's no disrespect to them, but they can only prevent the very worst from happening. And there's a certain level at which, when you've been around the kind of violence and stuff that exists in society and you're familiar with it, you sort of see what this is about. And yet you also heartbreakingly discover, if you pay attention, what this cannot do. And so to think that the pressure can be put on the police to do what cannot be done is to miss the fact that a managerial society cannot do what another kind of society would be doing. And for a long time, there were cultures and people who collectively believed in this possibility that we could heroically shape the future. I think this is increasingly not believable. And so I go back and forth on it myself. But one thing I will not buy into is the idea that theory can explain anything. I think the human brain, and I begin with us as brains, as bodies, and so that just increases the difficulty of our situation. But because of that fact, I don't think that anyone has access to a transcendental experience, or that they have a theory that explains with any rational certainty or believable certainty how 7-8 billion people are supposed to orient their lives. I think that there's a sort of decentralized autonomy that the anarchist in me like wants to animate in others, which ultimately means that no, you can think on your own. But this is completely challenged by the fact that people are, I'm a big believer in people, but there's a strong tendency in them towards ignorance and towards preferring acting in ways that are violent and actually very, very stupid, more often than I want to even admit or see. And so, having accepted that on a certain level, I'm very suspicious of any overly enthusiastic claim about the possibility of resurrecting liberal ideals. And yet I will continue to vote myself. But as anarchists used to say, like, don't just vote. Like, it's a minor tribute to what includes another kind of participation. But I also reject community. I reject all of that stuff, all of the replications of past collective actions, because I see that as being something that Google has told people that they want to hear. When you think about it, what we do when we engage in our left-wing political actions is largely confusing, like the process of political thinking for the outcomes of political thinking. And that is something that is crucial given the fact that no one really has a plausible vision. And my contention is that the variability of everyday life, of what's happening, perhaps given like the globalization of our world, the interconnectedness of everything, really prevents in many ways the possibility of ideals and narratives that have in fact become so intimate and so fundamental to who we are. But we can't be sentimental about that. I think what we have to do is really to step back and to not imagine that we can turn away from the situation that we're in, or that we can go backwards. We have to go through this darkness. There's no other way except going through it. And yet there's something, if you study all of the moments in human history where we have come back from nothing. I mean, if you think about our geological time and our human situation within that geological time, you see that we have been confronted with apocalypse time and time again. There's something fundamentally heroic about human beings. Like, one way to put it is that we love a good story. Like, we love a good story so much that it could be in us to weave out of all of this wreckage and all of this brokenness, to take all of these pieces and make something anew, to tell it anew. And there's a sense in which, in order to tell it anew, we have to break the news. We have to tell breaking news. We have to sort of have the courage to endure this up and down of our era, this opening of our era, in spite of all of its difficulty, in order to pay attention and to see how we can take what is real and what is sincere, and we can let die what is false and what is really just like symbolic, and what is ultimately out of touch with the underlying urgent, universal human desire for what we call freedom, whatever that might mean. And it's ironic, given that even in having that freedom, you can fall right on your face, because it presents another kind of project. It demands another kind of thinking. And so I've certainly said too much so far. I just wanted to read that essay and sort of offer an introduction to my concept of Para Noir, and sort of use this as an opening to my next writing, which will be a further examination of what I have learned in stepping back. But also, what I haven't told you is that I've also voted. I said that in other videos. I probably said it in the last one. But I sort of like had a return of this belief in constitutional liberalism, or, democratic republic liberalism. And that's something that I was really excited about a couple of years ago when I discovered the works of W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois. And I was really animated very deeply by listening to the recordings of Martin Luther King Jr., and more than that, reading a lot of his pieces that I'd never seen before or read before, and sort of discovering that there was something going on in him that wasn't what I thought, and I don't think it's what other people think. But it brought to life another kind of thing that is within me, and is quite contrary to what I call Para Noir. Because when I think about the affirmative with what I affirm, and that's sort of like when I said that I have pulled back from social media or from having conversations about politics, and that I wanted to study deeply everything that everybody thought as much as I could, including people I disagreed with. I also, thirdly, wanted to do something that's really important to me, because it comes out of a realization about something that, funny enough, has to do with fighting, like getting in fights or being in potentially physical conflicts. It applies to intellectual life politically, especially when you're thinking about ideas and ideologies and things that you can believe. And it has to do with the fact that you'll never win if you're on the defensive. Like, on a certain level, if you're in a physical interaction with somebody, like, you can't allow yourself to be in a defensive position, because you're more likely to lose, and they have the upper hand. And so you have to have the authorship or the authority to take that upper hand. And of course, I'm not advocating fighting or anything, but there is a sense in which if one is in a situation, there are particular underlying principles. And I think intellectually, this is more important, because not taking the defensive intellectually means that you decide what counts as a political problem. Like, you decide what counts as an emergency. You decide what counts as the end of the world. And you determine that by determining what specific issues there are. Because I think on a really deep level, I was controlled by a number of ideas that had tapped into my unresolved pain, my unresolved hatred and self-pity and anxiety and depression. I was so tightened up all my life, so tightened up that I was, as it said, I was recuperated. My mind was recuperated by radical revolutionary ideals. Now, I'm not one of those ones that's saying that you shouldn't believe in radical ideals or that I don't have radical ideals. But I think one should be very sensitive to the degree to which you're being bamboozled by people who are telling you that there is a crisis going on. Because as soon as somebody tells you that there's a big problem or a crisis, you automatically think, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do if that huge thing is happening or is going to happen? Because then you're sort of like locked in for them to control your mind. And there's a certain level at which it's beautiful to be bamboozled because you sort of learn much more deeply these ideas and ideals. And I have, in my own naivety, learned so much just by being naive and buying in. And then also by not only being naive, but also being committed to the process of changing my mind when I no longer thought it was reasonable to believe what I believed. And so that gives you a certain detachment from your insanity over time. But I do think that there are a lot of people who are completely out of touch with what's happened since the election of Donald Trump, which I don't mean to focus on because that's a small event in terms of the other events that have been occurring since forever, given the fact that we are living in an age that is bewilderingly destabilized. And there's a sense in which people fundamentally cannot deal with explicit facts. They can't confront the reality of their situations. So there's a tendency to hold on to beliefs and notions on the left and the right. And it's no wonder that those with a sort of a truly critical open-mindedness are often in the middle. And yet those people in the middle actually disagree more than the people on the extreme left and the extreme right. Like the people in the middle tend to disagree in ways that it's really profound. And that's hard to explain, and perhaps that calls for another video. But what I have to say is that the left and the right and the radical tendencies they have, whether it's conspiracy theories, Pizzagate, or whether it's, the belief in particular leftist, like truisms that I'll let remain nameless. I think that there's a sense in which reality itself has started to pierce into the fantastical, crazy reality that we've created in being in an age of surplus, in an age of absolute luxury and absolute freedom, to the point where we're sort of drowning in what was supposed to give us buoyancy. And I think that there's a point, which is that these events that are happening, like Trump, but also religious extremism that's rising worldwide, the authoritarianism that's happening, the rise of, this Armageddon that's going on in different parts of the world that's leading to a massive rise of political refugees. And when you see the violence that's occurring both with suicide and with homicide, with mass shootings and a lot of other things, you see that there's a reality going on that doesn't fit in at all to how the left and the right are wanting to think it is. They both actually believe a similar fantasy, which is they believe in theory itself. Not that theory isn't relevant, and I'm a theorist par excellence. I'm sort of like an intellectual engineer. Don't tell anyone. But I think there's something to be said for the those in the middle, who are often the first ones to die in a political crisis. And it's no wonder that my anarchist ancestors have often been the first ones who die, because in many ways the real anarchists are often not really vocal or violent. They're often in the sensitive middle, meaning that anarchy means a desire to build relationships that are rooted in a universalism that is in many ways not so sexy and not so shiny, but it's wanting to wrestle with reality in a way that demands contingent compromise, which is what, in many ways, the American genius is for compromise. And so there's a sense in which I don't mean to suggest that mediocrity has any place, because what I mean to suggest is that it's not what people disagree about that really matters. It's what they actually secretly agree about. Because the left and the right disagree vehemently about a lot of things, but they have a lot of things in common. And these things are detrimental to who we are. Fundamentally, any theory that turns you against yourself or turns people against other people, I don't use the word evil, but there's a sense in which if anything is evil, it's that. It's anything that turns us against ourselves or turns us against other people. And I think that what's occurring is a exaggeration of an intensity that is driven by their perception of the other side. And it's driven by a kind of hatred that I find to be the most repugnant thing. The resentment, the resentment, the blinding hatred that destroys everything, and it destroys you too. That's what I find to be completely disappointing, and yet that's exactly what I was. I was a hop, step, and a skip away from being something that I can't really say, because it comes from a place in me that was so tightly wound up. And given my childhood experiences, the way in which my mind was recuperated, as I said, I was politicized. I was taking that experience and transforming it into a political project that was just completely out of touch with reality. And yet, of course, I learned a lot, and I am who I am because of it. And there's much of it that I still affirm. I think that we ought to be very sensitive to not just how that allows us to keep participating in this sort of spectacle. It doesn't allow us to deal with the actual reality of our lives, which demands another kind of critical thinking. So I know that I'm sort of all over the place, but I'm just really wanting to see how much I can say on a certain level. Now that I've gone over 45 minutes, I should probably stop. But I am hoping that people will give me responses. I have no idea. I'm just wanting to make this essay as good as I can, and I'll try to get it published. And so you're kind of on a journey with me as I try to get some of this stuff published. I will read more interesting stuff. Believe it or not, I write poems and I write stories. So I'm going to record all of that stuff too. But my essays are my babies, and I've been working on them for a long time in private. And like I say again and again in these videos, I'm sort of going public with that private world, And it is weird just to be here. It's strange just to be recording myself even still. But now that I've begun this, I can't imagine doing anything else. So I love you guys. I'm John Edward Willie, and this is Circle 8.